Welcome to Chess News number 34, and I want to take a look at the game that was played yesterday between Magnus Carlsen and Viswanathan Anand. It is a historical game in the sense that it was Magnus' first win over Anand so far in a series over the board chess game. He has beaten all the other favorites, including Topalov and Kramnik, but he never managed to beat Anand, so he did that yesterday for the first time. And, well, it was quite an entertaining and interesting game, so let's have a look at what happened. Carlsen plays d4, and Anand goes for the Slav, which seems to become the all-time favorite at the top level. After knight f6, Magnus plays an early e3 here, also inviting bishop moves now, but Anand goes for the semi-Slav with e6. And after knight f3 and knight bd7 we could have a proper Meran. The main line of course then runs bishop d3, but Carlsen has something else up his sleeve. He plays here queen c2, which is also a very popular move. Now bishop d6 is considered to be the main line, and now Shirov's, or should we say Shabalov's, sharp g2, g4. I remember another game that was played between Alexander Morozevich and Kramnik, and I don't recall in which tournament, but it was played last year, and it's also on my website somewhere. I discussed that game also, and Morozevich managed to win a very nice game against Kramnik there. And well, black has several options here. I suppose the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and Anand just decides to go for knight takes pawn. Other moves include d takes c4 or bishop b4 or h6, which is also a very solid idea, just to try and prevent g4, g5, which reminds me a little bit of the Kiddes attack in the Sicilian Scheveningen. Okay. Well, like I said, Anand takes the pawn here, knight takes g4, and of course the point now is the attack of the rook over the g file, where there are now two black pieces under attack. Several options again are available here for black, and Anand chooses well, I wouldn't say a safe one, but at least one that has proven to be rather effective, and it's a counter defense, because by attacking the white knight he ensures himself, of course, of the material equilibrium, because after rook takes g4, which is what Carlsen played, Anand now recaptures on f3, and the queen is sitting quite, well, irritatingly there on f3. It's not your everyday position where after 9 moves you have such a queen so close to your king, but after rook takes g7, for the moment it is white who has the initiative, and he is threatening to take the pawn on h7. Furthermore, his position in the center is of course a little bit more aggressive because of this pawn lever. Okay, now Anand plays here knight f6 just to defend the pawn on f6, and now Carlsen plays h3, just moving his pawn out of the way from the bishop on d6, also sometimes preparing a knight jump to g4, and yeah, he wants to follow up now with bishop g2, I suppose, and have a very nice development. Okay, Anand now plays a very weird move, and I suppose it must be a new move. I couldn't really find any earlier examples with this move. I suppose a normal move would be something like king f8, just to chase away the rook, you know, and then continue your development of the queen side, for instance. But in this position after h3, Anand seems to put an awful lot of faith in what we normally would call a very bad pawn structure. He plays queen f5 and proposes the exchange of queens. Now, I don't think that Carlsen thought about this too long, because after queen takes f5 and e takes f5, it becomes clear that black has some very ugly pawns sitting there on the f-file, double pawns on f5 and f7. Also, the pawn on h7 is somewhat weak, but you could say the same for the pawn on h3, of course. But these guys here on f5 and f7, well, I don't know. I think there will be a burden later on, as we will see, for black. So, of course, you can try and play like this, and I wouldn't say that black is losing, far from that. But it just makes your game that much more difficult, and you have to play very carefully all the time. Now, Carlsen tries to create some more targets now with c takes d5. He would also like a weakness on d5. Now, the normal move is probably here knight takes d5, which maintains a black pawn on c6, and thereby prevents knight b5. But after c takes d5, I think that Anand is committing the first rather serious inaccuracy of the game, because here he plays c takes d5, and in doing so, he allows white a bit of an initiative here with knight b5. Now, since the knights are not exchanged, for instance, on the d5 square as in this earlier line, which could happen here, of course it is now possible for whites to play his knight to b5, and in doing so he now attacks this quite important black square bishop. I suppose Anand could use some of his calculating power here, and also the fact that chess is a very concrete game. He had a number of options here. For instance, bishop f8. But then he is at the wrong side of the board after knight c7 check. King e7. The king must keep protecting the f7 pawn. Rook g1. The rook was attacked, of course. And now rook b8. Black's rook was also attacked. But on b8, the rook is vulnerable, and white can now play a very surprising move, which is e3, e4, trying to make use of the vulnerability of the rook on b8. Now, a normal move would be f takes e4, saying, well, thank you, that's a beautiful pawn, but of course white would play his bishop to f4 and win the exchange. For instance, after bishop e6, knight d5 discovered check, knight takes d5, and bishop takes b8. And this line really is rather forced, and, well, white has the pair of the bishops, and the exchange. Of course, black is centralized, and white has a few weak pawns here, but I still think that white's advantage is rather serious here. Of course, now he's also attacking the a-pawn, so black should do something about that, and then white can look for another move just to strengthen his position. So that explains why after knight b5, Anand chose to play bishop b4 check. But in doing so, of course, he helps a little bit with white's development, because Carlsen now plays bishop d2, threatening bishop again, and now king f8, rook g1, bishop takes d2, king takes d2, king e7 could have led to the game, only with the white rook on g1. So I suppose that could be considered a small improvement for black, but what Anand plays here after bishop to 2 is also not bad. Bishop takes d2 immediately he plays, and after king e2 he plays king e7. And yeah, I suppose he has to be rather quick here, because white is also threatening to take over the long diagonal and the c-file, and he really starts to hit black's weaknesses. So king e7 here. Okay. Next, Carlsen played here bishop d3. Now this move makes sense. It just continues his development. He is of course nicely targeting this weak pawn on f5, and yeah, in a way you could say he's also connecting his rooks like this. Anand now played bishop e6, and I think that was a further inaccuracy, because here the bishop will be a target for the white knight. And I think that instead of bishop e6, maybe bishop d7 looks a bit more precise, because it's attacking the knight rather than acting as a target for the knight. And white could try here rook a g1 for instance, but then after bishop takes b5 and bishop takes b5, rook a g8 leads to the exchange of all the rooks, and that is a big difference in contrast to the game where white still had an active rook he could play with. So in this type of endgame, white is not so far as later in the game because of the miss of the rook there. So after bishop d7, I suppose knight c3 retreating would be stronger. You know, just keeping this knight to add to the pressure on this weak pawn. And then also rook a g8 would be possible. But then after rook a g1, rook takes g7, rook takes g7. I suppose that now a move such as rook g8 is not good, because the knight on f6 is overloaded. It has to protect, it has to protect both pawn and rook. So white would play knight d5 and reach a winning position there. But after rook g7, black would be able to play knight d4. This looks very nice. I mean, if you have one advantage with your weak pawns, then surely it is that you overprotect the e4 square a number of times. But even here white can maintain a small advantage, but probably not as big as in the game after bishop takes e4, d takes e4 and knight d5. You know, sometimes preparing to bring the knight here, and of course he still has an active rook. But in this position it's not bishop against knight, it's knight against bishop. And, well, I'm not sure really which minor piece is better here. The bishop on d7 I'm sure also has a future. Okay, so back to the game where Anand played bishop e6, and after bishop e6 Magnus now decided to go for the bishop in the style of Fischer, like that with knight c7. So rook a g8 was played, and now the in-between knight e6 is possible because it's protecting the rook on g7. And you remember that I mentioned earlier that the rook could be on g1, which would make the move f takes e6 possible. But now the f pawn is pinned, so Anand is forced to recapture with his king here, and he is still stuck with these two weak pawns on d5 and on f5. Now Magnus decides to exchange one pair of rooks here. Rook takes g8, knight takes g8 is played. I suppose that after rook takes g8 you can go rook c1 and try to seize the c-file. So that is probably why he plays knight takes g8, because after rook c1 you could try maybe knight e7, and then after rook c7 you can defend with rook b8. But nonetheless, I suppose this was an option for Magnus to go like this. However, after knight takes g8, which prepares to bring the knight to a better square, I understand now Yeah, why Anand attacks with the knight. Magnus chose to keep his options open, you know, whether to go with the rook to the c file or the g file, and rather improve his king first, which makes sense because, well, really in all the variations I suppose the king should go to f4, so it makes sense to keep your options open where you want to put the rook, as long as that's not very clear. Of course the king wants to move to f4 and then maybe follow up with f2, f3, and at some moment support also the first e3, e4. Okay, now Anand goes knight e7, and this is a nice defensive move because it overprotects both weaknesses. It also protects c8, so after rook c1 he could oppose with rook c8. And there's also an aggressive side to this knight move. It is that if white's king would ever appear on f4, then knight g6 would just check it and chase it away again. So yeah, I like this rerouting of the knight as opposed to just bringing it back to f6, when rook c1 would really be quite a strong move. Black could easily go wrong now, for instance, with rook d8, and rook c7, and now rook d7. Makes sense, but is actually a mistake because it allows the transition into a winning endgame like this. Rook takes c7, knight takes d7, and from here the knight has trouble protecting the pawn on f5. You know, it takes at least 4 moves, I guess, to protect this pawn. So now king f3, preparing to win the pawn on f5, is leading to a very advantageous position for white. So after rook c1, rook b8 would be better, but then rook c3, sometimes with the idea of switching to the a file, looks very nice for white. Nothing winning, but very tangible advantage for sure. Okay, back to the game, where knight e7 was played, and Carlsen just follow-ups with king f3. Now, rook g8 was possible. Not just to take away the g file and say to white, well, listen, you can't go to the g file, and as soon as you go rook c1, well, maybe then I just play rook c8, something like that. Instead, he moved rook c8 immediately, and I suppose that now it would have been strong for Carlsen to go to the g file. But still, he keeps his options open, and instead of rook g1, which is very direct, he opted for a4. Now this is an interesting move, but I'm not sure if it's objectively the strongest, because rook g1 just seems so straightforward, you know, just to go like that. Anyway, a4 introduces also the shift of the white rook over the third rank to try and attack the b pawn. So instead of keeping his options open, Carlsen is even adding more options to the list for his rook. It can now go to the b file or the c file or the g file. And Anand now tries a waiting strategy here with rook c7. a5 is played here, sometimes maybe playing with the idea of playing a5, a6 even, which would attack the white squares. And again a waiting move here, h6 by Anand. Now, Kramnik also improves now the position of his h-pawn. Sometimes it can go here to chase away the knight, if the knight were ever to occur on g6, which makes sense also. And king f6 is now played. This, by the way, protects the g7 square, so it's not so easy now for Carlsen to enter over the g file. h5 was played here, and well, it's possible to move the knight now, knight c8, which is what Anand did. You might ask yourself, well, is h4, h5 not allowing king g5 when black is maybe taking over the initiative? Well, of course, you could ask yourself that question, But usually, you know, when your king is in the center, you bring it to the edge of the board like that, it's not a very good idea. And in fact, it fails tactically, because after rook g1, you're forced to go back, since king takes h5 would be a horrendous blunder, locking up your own king on the h-file. And after king f4, which opens up the possibility of bishop c2 and checkmate to follow, black is just dead lost. There is no saving the game here. Knight g6 check, for instance, fails to king takes f5, and white has an easy winning game. So that explains why after h5 black is not going on any excursion with his king, but rather plays knight c8. But this of course allows king f4. Well, I mean, king f4 was possible anyway, because knight g6 check was ruled out by h4, h5. So we understand now also why Magnus put his pawn here on h5. Okay, now after knight d6, it seems that black has improved the position of his knight. You know, it was on e7 before, and now it's on d6, so it's a little bit closer to the center, and it influences, of course, the e4 square, which is a square that is quite vital to white's strategy, because he wants to play f3 and then e3, e4 to try and open up the position and make his bishop more active. So, yeah, it makes sense that Anand reroutes his knight once again, like he did with knight g8, e7, now c8 to d6. But the funny thing is that later on, white will also reroute his bishop. It will go from d3 to b3. We will see that. Anyway, now Carlsen introduces a cat and mouse game. He plays now rook g1 and is threatening rook g8. Now black cannot allow that, so he must go rook c8. And this is a very interesting moment in the game, because Anand plays a move that looks perfectly normal, that seems right both from a defensive and offensive point of view, but he seems to slip up and lose most of his advantage, as he now misses out on the opportunity to try and dominate the knight with the very interesting a6. Let's have a look at this move. He could play this move, but he didn't. He played f2, f3 in the game, which prevents knight e4 and of course prepares e3, e4 in the long run. But somehow he seems to lose most of his advantage, because in the game Anand could have played now a6, ruling out white from playing a6 himself, and in this position it's very hard to see what white can do. He can't really move up the board with his rook, and he can't also go to the c file. So let's go to the position after rook c8 and investigate a little why a6 would be such an interesting option. Now, first of all, b takes a6 is possible, of course. Then white would switch his rook back to the a file and would start a very nice initiative on the queen side. Rook c8, which is, I guess, necessary to protect all the pieces on the sixth rank. But rook a5 starts to attack one of the weaknesses from the side, king e6, and only now f3, with the idea, I suppose, to move e3, e4, which sometimes also introduces the fork d4, d5, if black were ever to recapture with his d-pawn, so that's very important. Well, that explains why black would, for instance, move his rook out of the way and attack white's b-pawn. But then white could play b4, threatening before b5, I guess, or again maybe introduce the idea of e4 or just take on a6. Anyway, after rook b4, which appears to be the best move, white would actually be winning here after rook takes a6. He is now threatening the pawn on f5 because the knight on d6 is pinned. He's also threatening the pawn on a7. And I suppose black must undo the pin with rook b6 But now white has rook takes a7, and again black is faced with these horrible weaknesses on d5 and f5, and the threat would be quite simple: to move around the bishop c2 to a4 and then to d7, check, when the king would have to go to f5. But then rook a5 would be a strong attack, and after king e7, bishop f5 would be possible, you know. So after rook a7, the best way to try and play against that is not rook b2 to try and prevent bishop c2, because then rook a6 reintroduces the threat to the pawn on f5, but probably rook b3, but that would allow bishop c2, and after rook c3, bishop b1 introduces again rook a6, which would lose the pawn on f5, so rook c6, but then rook a5, and it seems that black is going to lose his d-pawn. So indeed, to play a6 would be very interesting, and probably it would be wise for black not to take with b takes a6, because that would allow the strong switch to the a file. But probably after a6 it would be better to play b6, you know, just to keep things locked up. But then we can see one of the ideas, because white is also now really playing against that knight, and it's running short of squares, and yeah, it seems that white has improved his position a little bit, and only now again f3, when the burden is again on black, he could try something like b5, but then again white would have the interesting opportunity of bringing his rook to the a file to attack the pawn from a5, for instance, etc., etc. Okay, back to the game, where after rook c8, as mentioned, Carlsen played f3, but Anand played something weird now. Instead of playing a6, putting the burden of the proof on white, also ruling out a6, he played here the kind of weird king e6, but this lets go of the g7 square, and I'm really not sure if this was such a wise thing to do, you know. He could have tried a6 here, but he goes king e6, and now of course Carlsen jumps in, and it's very important for him to have this option of going rook g7, because it always has the threat of moving the rook to h7, winning the h-pawn. So in this case, Anand is more or less forced to play rook h8. And now Carlsen improves his bishop with c2. And yeah, maybe Anand should have tried king f6 here, when Carlsen was probably forced to go back, but he didn't. After bishop c2, he decided to play rook c8, which for the moment is possible, because rook h7 would now fail to rook takes bishop on c2, of course. But after bishop b3, Magnus has had two free moves to improve the position of his bishop, because he wants to attack d5, and again he's threatening rook h7, so again Anand is forced to go back with the rook, when in between he also could have moved his king to f6. Okay, well, king f6 maybe has the problem, let's not exaggerate here, that after rook g1, and now for instance rook c8, bishop b3, again would have forced king e6 when rook g7 was possible. Yeah, okay, so I understand now. It doesn't really matter. But I do think that it was important for Anand not to go king e6 here, but rather to play a6. I think this is really an inaccuracy. Anyway, so he played king e6, rook g7, rook h8, bishop c2, rook c8, bishop b3, rook h8, and now rook g1. He's continuing the cat and mouse game and threatening rook c1. So Anand has to go rook c8 again, and Carlsen goes again rook g7. He's also repeating the move so as to gain some time on the clock, and probably this is also psychologically very irritating for Anand. And of course he has to go rook h8, and here comes the big surprise, rook g2. Beautiful Zugzwang. I think Carlsen must be very happy that he has two open ranks here for his rook to play with, and that the pawn is on f3 rather than f2, because this move puts black into a Zugzwang position. If he moves the rook to the c file, then probably let's have a look at that. If he moves now to c8, then, yes, I'm sorry, this is the game, then Carlsen plays rook g1. And now both black rook and king can't play. If the rook comes forward, then the rook goes to g7 and h7. And if black's rook goes back to the king side of the center, then rook c1 will follow, and white will take over the c file. Also in this position, and that shows us why the bishop on b3 is very strong, also the king on e6 can't play, because it's forced to protect the pawn on d5, which explains why Anand chose to play here with his knight. But again, you could ask yourself the question, why not a7, a6? Well, you know, maybe in that case Carlsen could try the same trick again, you know, go rook g2, rook c8 and rook g1 and put him into a Zugzwang position again. And Anand could have thought, well, there's just another pawn on a white square, and his bishop is also on a white square, so maybe I just shouldn't put my pawn on a6. Let's lose the tempo immediately. Let's be in Zugzwang immediately and not later on. Okay, so let's go back to the game, where after rook g1, Anand now decided to play with his knight. Of course, f6 would also be quite a horrible move, because that would allow rook g6, of course. Yeah, very strong. So knight e8 was played. But this allows e4, because black is losing control over the e4 square when he retreats his knight to e8. And now after f takes e4 and f takes e4, we can see that the d pawn is pinned, which means that white can make considerable progress, since after knight f6, which was played in the game and also protects the pawn on d5, he was now able to play e4, e5. And, well, in order to gain a square, you have to give up a square, because black now has e4 for his knight. But I suppose there is a lot of wisdom to this aphorism by Fischer. In order to gain a square, you have to give up a square. Which also reminds me of a famous quote of one of our Dutch soccer legends, Cruyff, Johan Cruyff, who used to say, every advantage has its disadvantage. In this case, however, it seems that the advantage of bringing your pawn to e5 is more significant than the disadvantage that black now has an outpost on e4 for his knight. Okay, so knight e4. And now I was looking at this position and I wasn't sure what was the best move for white. Carlsen played here king e3, and somehow I still think this is a mysterious move, and I tried to make sense of it. It looks good, but it's not immediately clear what is the point behind it. So I was thinking, okay, it clears the f file, which in a later complex of variations is important. We will see that. Also, it sidesteps knight coming to g5 and then double attacking the king and the rook from h3. So in that sense, it's also a prophylactic move. And maybe he wants to bring his bishop via d1 to g4 when the c2 square would be vulnerable. So maybe he wants to put his king on d3 just to keep Black's rook out. Because, yeah, it would make sense, I guess, to bring now the bishop back again to the king side to attack the king on e6, which is the blockader of the pawn on e5. And if Black would be careless, he would also lose his rook on c8 because of the skewer, of course. So, yeah, that's what I could come up with, and some of these points will come to light later on. And it's the 40th move. I don't really recall if they were in serious time trouble, but we could also say this is the ominous 40th move, because Anand now really makes a serious mistake. He plays here b6, and yeah, he's just not appreciative enough of White's possibility of playing his bishop to d1. Okay, so they both made the time control, and well, you can expect Carlsen to walk around a little bit, drink some of his orange juice, sit back at the board, consider his next move, play a takes b6, when Anand recaptures, of course, and now bishop d1. And this is near winning. But the thing is, Carlsen didn't play this move. It would make so much sense to make this move, and I think he had time to consider this option. But yeah, I don't know if this thought ran through his mind at all, playing bishop d1, but it looks near winning. Of course, the threat is bishop g4, so play becomes again very concrete. So let's have a look at some rook moves. Rook d8, for instance, would allow rook c2, because Black has given up his control of the c-file. And, well, yeah, if you can chase the knight away from e4, which is threatened, you also lose the defender of the square on f6, which means that after knight g5, for instance, rook f1 is very strong with the threat, of course, of rook f6 winning, because look at these extra pawn weaknesses. Also, after bishop d1, rook b8 would lead to the same. Bishop c2 again. And after, for instance, rook c4, to try and keep control of the c-file, which is better, of course, then bishop g4 check is possible. And then after king e7, bishop f3 would be strong, because now the king is not protecting the pawn on d5. So if the knight moves, then the pawn on d5 will fall, of course, because of the influence of the bishop here. So after bishop g4 check, f5 is probably the best move to block the check. But then after e takes f6 check en passant, and king f6 again, the pawn on d5 is not protected, so bishop f3 would be strong again. Of course, here Black could now try king f5. But the line continues, bishop takes e4 check, d takes e4, and here the clearance, or the clearing, I don't know what's the correct word, of the f-file is very important. So the sidestep of White's king to e3, allowing rook f1 check, when after king takes e6, king takes e4, wins a pawn, and I think that White has all the chances to win this rook endgame. I think he's just simply better here. So, also possible after bishop d1, not rook c4, but rook c6, leading to similar lines. Again, bishop g4 check, f5, taking en passant check, king f6, bishop f3. And now, after rook e6, rook g6 would lead to a simple winning pawn endgame if we exchange all the pieces, which would be, by the way, one of the points of rook c6, because rook e6 is now protecting the knight on e4. So after bishop f3 again, king f5, but then we already know that bishop takes e4, d takes e4, and rook f1 wins the e4 pawn with very good winning chances. Okay, so You would Carlsen expect, or you would expect Carlsen to play bishop d1 here, but he now slips up quite seriously and he plays king d3 here. Okay, maybe he first wants to overprotect the c2 square and then go bishop d1, but I mean, he's a great calculator. He's the number 2 or 3 in the world. I mean, he can see better than me that these lines will probably give him an advantage, you know, also without touching the pieces on my digital chessboard here. Anyway, food for psychologists, we would say. And now, of course, it's very important for Anand to try and kick around and make White's life difficult as possible. So, knight f2, just harassing the king. The king goes back to e2 now. Yeah, why not to e3? Well, then they could repeat the position. Okay, but if they repeat the position, then again bishop d1 would be possible, but Carlsen goes for e2. Maybe he just didn't really consider the idea of going to g4 with the bishop. And of course now knight retreats, and now again king e3, putting the burden on black. But black could try knight g5 here and still be relatively stable, I guess. At least this blocks the rook from the g file, and also the knight is not a target anymore on e4. Bishop d1 would be possible. It wouldn't be possible in this case. Let's have a look. Well, then maybe f5, just to try and beat White to the punch, because if I now play like this, maybe would this be a wise move? Well, that would allow rook f1 check. Maybe it's wiser to think chess is not checkers and go rook f8, you know, just to prepare to take that pawn with the rook. And then after this check, maybe king d6 and then rook f1. Rook f7, of course, White would still enjoy the advantage, but that pawn on f6 needs constant attention. White would be better here, but not the kind of advantage you would want, I think, because this is the kind of advantage where you have to hang on to your extra pawn instead of trying to make headway in another way. But it was all to no avail, because after king e3, Anand did not play knight g5. Again, he made quite a serious mistake. He plays here f6. And why on earth would you allow the white rook access to g6? I don't understand this. These guys are world top players, and they've reached time control. They've got some time to think about their moves. But now, of course, Carlsen hops in with rook g6 and has an overwhelming advantage now. So, yeah, I don't know, maybe Anand was scratching his head also when he saw White's rook appear on g6, and now, well, he really has one task left, and that is to try and harass the white king for as much as is possible. So he plays rook c1. But now again, Carlsen slips up, more or less winning, but maybe difficult to see. Would have been e takes f6, and now not knight takes f6 because of the overloading motif bishop takes d5. But after e takes f6, rook e1 check, king d3, knight takes f6, again the overloading motif bishop d5, king f5, not allowing the exchange of pieces there. But after bishop f3, which protects against a check on d1, also protects the pawn here, prepares to take here, so keeps the knight on f6 pinned, prepares to move this pawn. I think White has, well, a near winning or maybe even winning position here. So, of course, tension was building, because this was probably the first time that Carlsen was going to beat Anand, you know, so it makes perfect sense that he was not able to find the most precise moves all the time. And I suppose that Anand also wasn't feeling too well, because Carlsen has the advantage, for a long time already. So they exchange these mistakes. So after rook c1, where e takes f6 is probably winning, Carlsen now goes rook h6. And of course it's very nice to win a pawn, but he is putting his rook in front of his own h-pawn. And Anand now finds the most tenacious move by putting his rook behind that free pawn. And of course he also has several checks, be it from the first rank or from the h-file, to harass white's king. Okay, I don't think that at the moment white has a winning advantage. But of course Carlsen can play on. And now he starts to pressure this knight again, and this knight is a very important piece, of course, because it's also the main defender of the pawn on f6. So Anand should have played here rook e1 check, and after king d3 there is no threat from the bishop to the knight, so he could go rook h1 again. Note that after rook e1 check and king f4, black just keeps chasing the king with rook f1 check. But for the third time in a row, Anand now makes a mistake. He made a mistake with b7 b6, he made a mistake with f7 f6, and he also made a mistake now with rook h3, which is not the correct checking square, which is, as I just pointed out, rook e1. So he went rook h3 check, and now king f4 still threatens bishop takes e4, and the only check available now is from h4, but Carlsen goes f3 again, threatening bishop takes e4. And I guess that rook h3 now would be simply answered, of course, with king g4. And now both knight and rook are threatened here, so black must lose his f-pawn also. So after king f3, black's moves are becoming more and more cramped, and he has to go now for knight d2, which is also losing the defense of the f6 square, of course. And winning here was rook g3. Maybe it was not so easy to see for Carlsen, because after the otherwise quite forced variation rook takes d4, rook takes f6 check, king takes e5, rook f5 check, king e6, h6, white is winning. But there is a point to the end of this rather long variation in which white must consider to sacrifice his two beautiful center pawns just to try and queen his h-pawn, because now black can play not knight e4, because after this exchange with the idea of bringing the rook to the h file, king f4 would threaten the e-pawn, and after this small intermezzo white would be winning. But after h6, rook c4, so the lines are quite complicated, Carlsen had to see all of this. h7, rook c8 fails to rook g5, which threatens bishop f5 and also threatens rook g8, but h7, rook takes c2. And now the strongest way to promote your queen, and this is also possibly something that Carlsen may have missed, is rook e5 check, exclamation mark, because now you can queen with check, and this position should be winning for white. Anyway, so after knight d2, the strongest move would have been king g3, but we saw these lines are not so easy, so in the game Magnus went king e2, and I guess that he's still winning, and yeah, okay. His knight is now attacked, and rook d4 would run into rook f6 again, etc., etc. But that's not what Anand played. Anand chose to defend with rook h2 check, and now king d1, still attacking, still attacking the knight, so the black rook has less mobility. Knight now going to c4, not to e4, because there it would be eaten, followed by rook takes f6. But he now prepares to take the pawn on b2. Carlsen, of course, now played rook takes f6. King e7 was played. And everything fits now for him. Not only is black threatening knight e3 check with the win of the bishop, but he's also threatening the h-pawn. But Carlsen has bishop g6, salvaging his bishop and his pawn. Now rook takes b2 makes sense, but then h6, rook h2, h7 would win, rather simple. So after bishop g6, rook d2 was played, and darn it, again Carlsen slips up somewhat. He plays here king c1. Very advantageous for him would have been king e1, and we will see later on why. The king is on a better square here. Rook takes d4, h6, rook h4, bishop f5, d4, rook e6, leading to a winning position for Carlsen. All because of the fact that he can push his h-pawn. But after the game move, king c1, and rook takes d4, unfortunately h6 would not be possible because of rook h4, bishop f5, and now rook h1. And this is the difference and shows why king e1 was stronger, because now the white king is forced to go forward, king c2, but then of course knight e3, king d3, black manages to exchange this horrifyingly strong bishop. And after rook takes f5 and rook takes h6, there's just a dead drawn endgame on the board. So after rook d4, Carlsen had to refrain from going h6 and play b3. He still holds the advantage though. But the pawn on e5 is lost now, but he regains one on b6. So still, black has managed to re-centralize his knight. It's not on e4 but on e5 now, and it's still very difficult. It's not a winning position, I would say. And of course Anand again puts his rook behind this free h-pawn. Okay, now Carlsen plays bishop f5, threatening rook e6, winning the knight. Also preparing pawn h6, and also now the bishop can no longer be taken at g6. But it is Anand who makes the last mistake. It's the fourth one in a row. Necessary was rook h1 to wrong-foot the white king. And as we will see, the white king really does not have an ideal square here. Let's have a look at king d2, for instance, when there would follow the amazing knight c4 check, threatening king and rook, so forcing b takes c4. But after rook takes h5, black is attacking both the bishop and the pawn. So after bishop g6, for instance, and rook h2, saving the rook, king c3, d takes c4, we now have the normally theoretically drawn endgame of rook and bishop versus rook. Of course Carlsen could try to play on, but you would expect Anand just to draw this. So that was king d2 after rook h1. Let's have a look at king c2 then. Well, then knight f3 would be possible, threatening the fork on d4. Of course h6, knight d4 check. So bishop g6 then would be played, but after knight d4, black again seems to be holding. Okay, well, let's have a look at king b2 then. Knight c4 would follow, the same trick, b takes c4, rook h5, g6, rook h2 check, king c3, and d takes c4. And again, the aforementioned endgame of rook and bishop versus rook. So, this rook h1 check was vital to Anand's defense. But he did without. After bishop e5, he played knight f3. And now Carlsen has a very beautiful trick. And fortunately for him, he spotted it and Anand didn't. h6. Now he's really starting to move this guy. And of course, for the moment, it's protected. But hey, Anand must have thought, I can attack your bishop now. But Carlsen says, well, you want to attack my bishop? You can take it. I just move my pawn to h7. And it's indirectly defended by the Röntgen check possibility over the 7th rank. So the pawn cannot be taken. Knight takes f5 was forced here. Of course, white was threatening rook b8 into queen. But now he goes rook b8 anyway, because the rook still can't take the white pawn because of rook b7 check, winning the rook and thereby the exchange. And now after knight d4, which was really Anand's last try, Carlsen played a precise move now. He waits with promoting, but first saves his b-pawn and only then wins the exchange. So the remainder of the game was king d6, queens, rook takes queen, rook takes rook. And now after king c5, Carlsen still has to show some good technique, of course, which consists of not blundering his pawn or rook. That in the first place, but the advantage for the rook side is always that you can keep your rook on the edge of the board, so as far away out of the reaches from the black knight as possible. And furthermore, he has to keep black's king cut off, and of course he has to start pushing his own free pawn. This is the winning plan. So he starts with rook h5, just pinning the pawn and keeping the king to the protection of the pawn on d5. Knight c6 was now played. Rook h4, he's just looking a little bit for the right setup of his pieces. Now knight b4, and here comes king a3, which chases the knight, and after knight c2, king a4. We would see such a variation, for instance d4, rook h5 check, which forces the black king back, king d6, and now b4. Moving the own free pawn up the board. After d3, king b3 would be winning, because this king, is just going to demolish this block, and this rook here is keeping this guy out of the game. And if white plays it correctly without giving up his own b-pawn, he's winning here, of course. But after king a3, Anand played d4. But then Carlsen went rook h5 check. Now this forces knight e5, otherwise the knight is lost. And now king b2 was played. And now the king can't go to b4, and the knight also can't go to b4. So, yeah, there's really nothing much you can play. I suppose you can play d3, but then you're really also loosening your grip, because this pawn, it may be closer to the promotion square, but it is also closer to the white king. So Anand preferred king c6. And then Carlsen again went here king a3. King c5. Now rook h4, trying again to bring black into some kind of zugzwang here. Knight b4. Still Carlsen has not found the absolute correct setup. Rook h8. Rook c6, but now he seems to make progress with this check. Rook h5 check, really forcing back the king, and now he can move his own pawn. Yes. Okay, and in doing so, he seriously limits the mobility of the black knight, and the king is also cut off, so Anand now decides to push his pawn, but of course now this pawn becomes a target for the white pieces. Rook h3, knight e5, still protecting, but king b3 moves the king closer to that pawn, and after d2 and king c2, the final moves were knight c6 and protecting your own pawn, rook h4. Anand resigned. Well, that brings us to the end of a long discussion. It was an interesting game in which both sides exchanged a number of mistakes, but I suppose that the win was justified for Carlsen. And if we go back, I think that it was mainly due to the fact that Anand offered the exchange of queens early on in this position here after h3 with queen f5, when after the exchange he really had quite a serious deficit in his pawn structure. Also after c takes d5, allowing knight b5 with some advantage. And well, let's just quickly run through the game for a wrap up. Here white also wins the bishop for the knight, so he has the better minor piece, improving his king position here, keeping the options for his rook open, and in the end, yeah, trying or deciding on the g file. Of course, Anand allowing here rook g7, where a7, a6 would have been better. Now improving the position of his bishop and playing the cat and mouse game here, bringing black into a zugzwang with rook g1, which forced the movement of the knight, and now he could push his pawn, and that meant he made serious progress, putting the pawn on e5, and from this moment on he had a more or less winning position. Here was the first mistake by Anand, which could have been punished with bishop d1. It didn't happen. And now f6, very weird move, just allowing rook g6. But again, rook takes h6 was somewhat slipping up. E takes f6 would have been stronger, I guess. And here a wrong check, where rook e1 would have been better. So again winning because of the pressure on the knight on e4 and the pawn on f6. Always threatening the knight. And everything fits here, with bishop g6 for white. And now Carlsen slips up somewhat, where rook e1 would have been much better. And well, we approach the end of the position of the game. Here it was absolutely necessary to play rook h1 check to wrongfoot the white king first, but Anand went knight f3 immediately. And now there was this very nice trick, moving the h-pawn down the board, making use of this Röntgen check on the 7th rank. And well, from this moment on, of course, white had a technically winning position. He needed some moves to find out the right setup to somehow bring black in a zugzwang position. Now he forces the black king back, moves his own pawn, goes after black's d-pawn, and in this position black resigned. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this game analysis. Thank you for watching, and please, until next time, bye bye.